The Omnitrix is not a weapon. You need to understand that before anything else, because every single decision that follows, every protocol drafted, every containment executed, every choice made in every conference room over those 11 days is built on the foundation of that one fundamental misreading. It is a cataloging device, a biological library, a suit of infinite evolutionary armor engineered by a mind so architecturally advanced that Tony Stark's most sophisticated diagnostics would require 40 years just to understand the outer casing. Reed Richards, when SWORD eventually forwarded him the energy signature readings, would go very quiet for a long time and then say, carefully, with the specific humility of the smartest man in a room confronting something smarter than him, "Whoever built this was operating at a level we don't have a number for." The Omnitrix does not choose targets. It does not fire. It does not aim. What it does, what it has always done across every universe where a child has worn it, is respond to threat, to fear, to the oldest biological imperative in any living catalog of 10,000 species: survive. And the Marvel Universe, as it was about to discover, gave it a great deal of practice. If you've ever wanted to watch a universe make its worst decision in real time, this is the video. And before we go any further, if this kind of deep dive, grimdark crossover storytelling is what you live for, you already know what to do. Subscribe. Notifications on. Because what follows is not a fight, it is a reckoning. And the Marvel Universe has never faced anything quite like a boy who has already saved one galaxy arriving bleeding and confused inside another that is pointing 11 helicopters at his head before it has learned his name. I want one answer from you in the comments right now, before we go 1 second further. Do you think the Avengers recruit Ben Tennyson? Or do they reach for the kill switch? Cast your vote, because that answer reveals more about what you believe this universe actually is than anything I'm about to tell you. S.H.I.E.L.D. had a protocol for everything. Alien Arrival, Protocol 7, Dimensional Breach, Protocol 12, Enhanced Individual, Unregistered, Civilian Proximity, Unknown Power Ceiling, Protocol 41, what the analysts called, in the language people use when official terminology fails them, the God Problem. Within 9 minutes of Luis Ortega's call, 3 black SUVs were moving. Within 14, a Quinjet was airborne. Within 22 minutes, Director Maria Hill had been woken, briefed, and handed a single highway camera photograph. A teenager standing in a scorched field, a green pulse on his left wrist, a perfect circle of flattened grass around him like a radius drawn by something that understood geometry at a molecular level. Hill studied the photograph for a long moment. Then she said something her aide declined to include in the official record. What she said was, "He looks scared. That's the problem. Scared ones are always worse." She was right. She was also wrong, in every way that mattered. And the gap between those two things was about to cost the Marvel Universe 11 days it would spend the next 30 years in classified hearings trying to account for. Doctor Strange felt it before any satellite did. He described it later as hearing a chord played on an instrument that did not exist. Familiar notes, impossible combination, the kind of dissonance that makes the walls of reality lean inward, listening. Wong was beside him. They exchanged a look carrying 17 years of shared context and one shared understanding. This was not dark magic, not demonic, not Dormammu, not anything their taxonomy of power had a shelf for. Strange opened a window with 2 fingers and stared toward New Jersey. "Get the diagnostic stones," he said quietly. "Whatever just arrived, it has a lot of living to do. And that worries me far more than something that came here to die." The first footage reached the internet at 7:34 a.m., 43 seconds. A shaky phone video from a car on Route 1. You can see the field, you can see the boy. And at the edge of the frame, in the moment before the battery dies, you can see the shape he becomes when the Quinjet drops below the cloud line and the sound hits him like a wall. It is not human. The footage gets 12 million views before S.H.I.E.L.D. pulls it. But 12 million is enough. The comment sections erupt in 47 languages, because everyone watching sees the same thing. The Avengers, moving towards something that has just decided, with total biological certainty, that it is not going to be caught. This wasn't an invasion. It was an introduction. and Marvel had already made its first mistake. The Marvel Universe is not a place. That is the single most important thing the history books never say plainly enough. Because saying it plainly makes it terrifying. It is a system. Layered, breathing, self-correcting, with redundancies built upon redundancies. Street-level enforcers at the bottom, government agencies above them, mystic orders above those, interplanetary coalitions above those, and somewhere at the very top, watching with eyes the size of planets, entities so old they remember when the universe was still deciding what shape to be. Every layer has a function. Every function has a protocol. And when something foreign enters the system, unrecognized, unregistered, uncategorized, every single layer activates simultaneously. Not strategically, not collaboratively, simultaneously. The way a body floods with white blood cells the instant it detects a pathogen it has never encountered. Ben Tennyson had been in the Marvel Universe for less than 40 minutes. Every layer was already moving, and not one of them had thought to ask him his name. At street level, it was Spider-Man who got there first. It is almost always Spider-Man who gets there first. Not because Peter Parker is the fastest, not because he runs the best intelligence network, but because he is constitutionally, biologically, spiritually incapable of hearing a police scanner and concluding that the situation belongs to someone else. He landed on a highway barrier at 7:52 a.m., took 4 seconds to process the scene, and ran his internal threat assessment in the way he always did. Not through technology, not through protocol, but through the part of him that had been doing this since he was 15 and had learned, painfully and permanently, that the most important variable in any unknown situation is always the human one. Boy, teenager, scared, Omnitrix cycling green-white on his wrist, alien geometries shifting across its surface like a language composing itself in real time. 6 high ELD agents at wide perimeter, none advancing, which meant they had already tried. Peter swung down slowly, landed 15 feet away, put both hands up, said the only thing that actually works. "Hey, my name's Peter, what's yours?" In Wakanda, the alert reached strategic intelligence at 8:03 a.m. local time. The energy signature was cross-referenced against the vibranium resonance database, the ancestral plane frequency logs, and Shuri's own cosmological anomaly index within 6 minutes. It matched nothing, which was, in itself, a category of information more interesting than any match would have been. Shuri pulled the satellite imagery. She studied the Omnitrix's surface geometry for 11 minutes without speaking. Her senior analysts had worked alongside her brilliance for 3 years and had never once heard her say what she said next. 4 words, quietly, with complete intellectual honesty, in the voice of someone who builds things that other people cannot imagine and who had just encountered something she could not build. "I don't know this." The council convened within the hour. The debate was immediate and predictable. Sanctuary versus security, humanitarian instinct against strategic calculation. The same argument this institution had versions of every time the world introduced something unprecedented. T'Challa listened to both sides with his hands folded. Then he asked the question no one else in any room that morning had yet thought to ask. What does the boy want? The room had no answer, because no room that morning had asked. At Kamartaj, Strange and Wong had established 3 things before the morning meditation bell. First, the Omnitrix was not mystical, not demonic, not celestial. It was orthogonal to their entire taxonomy of power, which was deeply unsettling to 2 men whose discipline was built on the foundational assumption that all power can eventually be named and therefore governed. Second, the arrival had left a hairline fracture in the dimensional membrane approximately 400 miles long, invisible to standard instruments, self-healing in roughly 6 weeks, unless something widened it. Third, and most critically, the fracture's resonance pattern was recursive. It had not merely scarred the membrane, it had, in some technical sense, they were still working to articulate cleanly, remembered the path it came through. The door was not fully closed. Strange marked that in his notes with 3 question marks. Then, after a moment, added a 4th. Because in his experience 3 question marks meant a problem, 4 meant a conversation he was not looking forward to having. Hydra had no ethical deliberation phase. Within 4 hours of the first footage going viral, 2 separate cells had begun independent acquisition planning. One focused on the Omnitrix as a device. Extraction, reverse engineering, weaponization, the standard mechanical ambition of an organization that had spent decades reducing every miraculous thing it encountered to a potential instrument. The other cell was run by a man named Harker, not a fighter, a planner, and Harker was focused on something more efficient than the Watch. He was focused on the boy's trauma. Because Harker understood something that Shy LD's psychologists were still drafting their preliminary reports about, something the Avengers were too busy arguing containment logistics to notice. Ben Tennyson had arrived in an unknown universe, surrounded immediately by people pointing weapons at him after what appeared to be an involuntary dimensional displacement that had separated him from everyone he had ever trusted. He was alone. He was 16. And a 16-year-old alone in a hostile universe who carries the power to reshape biology across 10,000 species. That is not a security problem. Harker wrote the word opportunity in his planning document and underlined it twice. He was not wrong about the vulnerability. He was only wrong about how it would end for him. The media named him before SHIELD could contain the story, which is another Marvel constant, as reliable as gravity, because journalists in this world have spent 20 years covering gods and dimensional horrors and have learned that the first name always sticks. The headline that defined him appeared within 6 hours across every major outlet simultaneously, as if the entire global press apparatus had arrived at the same 2 words through independent, convergent instinct. The Alien Kid, capitals, like a threat-level classification dressed as a descriptor. Ben Tennyson, who had spent 3 years of his life holding a collapsing galaxy together with alien hands, who had friends and enemies and a grandfather who believed in him without conditions, and a cousin who argued with him about everything and meant it as love, reduced to 2 words and a stock image of green light in a scorched field. Marvel doesn't fear power, it fears unregistered power. And the moment they named him without asking, the clock started running on something that could not be unstarted. Peter Parker spent 40 minutes sitting cross-legged in that field talking to Ben Tennyson before anyone else came within earshot. In his personal log, not the SHIELD debrief, the encrypted one he kept on his own hardware because he had learned early and hard that official records are written for official purposes. He wrote something that would become, in retrospect, the most accurate prediction produced in the entire first 72 hours by anyone with a badge or without one. He wrote, "He's not dangerous because of what he can turn into. He's dangerous because he is genuinely, completely good. And this system we've built is going to spend the next 6 months trying to break that out of him. I hope we don't make him into something he doesn't want to be." He closed the log. Above them, the helicopters maintained their circles. The Quinjet touched down at 9:15 a.m. The ramp opened. The Avengers stepped onto the grass. And Ben Tennyson, who had already saved a galaxy these people didn't know existed, looked at them with the expression Peter would spend years trying to describe accurately, finally settling on. The look of someone who has been through this exact moment before and knows with complete certainty how badly it is about to go. He wasn't wrong. He was, in fact, more right than he knew. Because behind the Avengers, already live on encrypted channels, already populating executive authorization frameworks with language designed to sound humane while meaning something else entirely, the system was doing what systems do when they encounter something they cannot categorize. It was drafting the document. The one with the careful words, the one that would take 11 days to finish and 30 years to declassify. The one that used phrases like sustainable framework and asset integration protocol, and in one subsection that a 3-person committee approved without fully reading, the phrase separation from wearer by any means necessary. None of that language existed yet at 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in a New Jersey field, but the instinct behind it did. It had existed since the first helicopter left the ground, and that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It tried to own them. The video that broke everything was 47 seconds long, not the Hoboken field footage. SHIELD had surgically scrubbed that one within the hour, chasing it across mirrors and reposts with the mechanical efficiency of an organization that had spent decades managing inconvenient truths. This was something different. This one came from inside. Filmed at Site Verdant, a converted Stark-era research annex in upstate New York. by a junior intelligence technician named Dara Osei, who had smuggled a secondary phone inside her left boot because 3 tours in field intelligence had taught her one lesson that no protocol manual ever states plainly. The things you are specifically instructed not to document are always, without exception, the things history most urgently needs documented. The video showed Ben Tennyson sitting alone in a white room, wrists on his knees, head down, Omnitrix visible. 3 agents entering, one reaching for his wrist, and then 11 seconds that would be replayed, dissected, weaponized, and misread by every institution and every media outlet and every frightened government on Earth for the next 11 days. The transformation lasted 11 seconds. That is the detail everyone missed, because by the time the footage reached public hands, the word monster had already been written into the narrative's foundation, and corrections never catch up to first impressions. What stood in that room was Diamond Head, a crystalline, silicon-based life form from a species that had survived 3 separate extinction events through sheer structural perfection. A biology that Reed Richards, upon reviewing the energy signature data 3 days later, would describe with uncharacteristic quietness as not engineered for combat, engineered for endurance. There is a difference, and it is a significant one. Diamond Head stood perfectly still, did not advance, did not strike, raised one arm, not to attack but to shield its wrist from the agent's reaching hand. The Omnitrix threat assessment had registered the grab as a seizure attempt and responded in the only language Azimuth had programmed it to use under duress: become what cannot be taken. 11 seconds. Then it was Ben again, back against the wall, breathing hard. I told you not to touch it. 3 agents in the corner, every hour of their training temporarily inaccessible to them, pressed against the wall like the wall was the only trustworthy thing left in the room. Dara Osei uploaded the footage at 11:23 p.m. from a gas station 2 miles outside the facility perimeter. By midnight, 4 million views. By 2 a.m., 19. By the time Director Hill convened the emergency response meeting at 4 a.m., the phrase "alien kid transforms" was trending in 47 countries. 3 major networks had field teams moving toward upstate New York, and the comment sections of every major platform had become a live civil war between 2 irreconcilable factions. Faction 1. He's a child. The agents grabbed at him first. This is exactly what government containment of enhanced individuals always becomes. Fear wearing the costume of protocol. Faction 2. That thing in the video is not a child. The watch is a weapon, and anyone defending him is dangerously naive about what an unregistered alien power source does to a world that has already survived 2 extinction-level events in a decade. Both factions were using the same 47 seconds. Both were partly right. That was the tragedy of it. Not that one side was wrong, but that the truth required more than 47 seconds to contain, and the world had already decided it didn't have more than 47 seconds to spend. The villains moved before sunrise, another Marvel constant, reliable as physics, because the machinery of institutional evil runs on shorter decision cycles than the machinery of institutional good. Evil doesn't require consensus. Harker's cell dispatched a 4-person extraction team at 3:17 a.m. The Magia sent a negotiator, not a fighter, a negotiator, which was somehow more disturbing, because negotiators only appear when someone has already concluded the situation is winnable through leverage rather than force. A broker known across 17 criminal networks placed calls to 3 separate buyers before dawn, offering what he described as the most significant alien biotech acquisition opportunity since the Chitauri invasion. He had no access. He had no plan. He had 47 seconds of footage and an instinct for the precise moment a market opens. In the Marvel Universe, that combination has started wars before. Here it was about to start something worse, a bidding process conducted in the dark over a 16-year-old boy who was sitting in a white room in upstate New York, listening to the facility go quiet around him in the specific way that places go quiet when everyone outside is very loudly deciding your fate. The fracture inside the Avengers began at 5 a.m. over a conference table, and 3 words that seemed, in isolation, almost interchangeable. Almost. The legacy, Captain America used the word protection. The Chi-LD liaison used containment. Stark's remote AI threat assessment, running diagnostics from a server that was technically off the official grid, and therefore carrying no institutional accountability for whatever it recommended, flagged the verdant energy readings and suggested a contingency classification using the word neutralization. 3 words. Same boy. 3 completely different moral universes hiding inside the bureaucratic precision of people who each believed, without performance, that they were the reasonable one in the room. The Sokovia Accords framework hovered over every sentence like weather, the legacy of the last time this system had encountered unregistered power, and concluded that the solution was a document, a signature, a managed surrender of autonomy in exchange for the right to continue existing. Ben Tennyson had not signed anything. Ben Tennyson had not been asked to sign anything. Ben Tennyson did not know the Sokovia Accords existed. The coffee went cold. No one noticed. The argument got quieter and more precise, which is always the sign that it is becoming permanent. Peter Parker was not in the conference room. He had gone back to the facility and sat outside the door of the White Room for 2 hours, not speaking, not offering anything, just present in the way. You are present for someone when presence is the only honest currency available. At 5:47 a.m., through the door, Ben's voice came quiet and flat and carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has been lied to by institutions before and has learned to recognize the shape of it through walls. They're going to put a kill switch on me, aren't they? Not a question. Peter opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. What he wanted to say was no. What came out after 4 seconds of free-fall silence was, "I won't let that happen." A pause. Then Ben, from the other side of the door, with 3 years of hard-won wisdom compressed into a teenager's bone-tired voice. "That's what the last person who tried to protect me said. Then the people they were protecting me from offered them something they wanted more." Peter sat with that sentence, sat with it for a long time. 50 meters away, in the conference room, the word neutralization was still in the document, cursor blinking, waiting. Nobody deleted it. The first real attack came at 6:03 a.m., and it did not come from Hydra. It came from a high-ELD splinter cell operating under a sub-protocol that Hill would later describe as unauthorized, in the technical sense that many terrible things are technically unauthorized. She had signed the protocol, not the timing. The plan was built from Banner-era research. A tranquilizer compound calibrated for enhanced physiology, introduced through the facility's ventilation at non-lethal concentration. 12 hours of unconsciousness. Time to draft the better language. Time to hold the vote with the word neutralization removed and something more palatable in its place. The compound reached the Omnitrix's biosensors 4 full seconds before it reached Ben's bloodstream, because Azimuth had engineered the Omnitrix to identify every threat across 10,000 species with the same priority A. Architecture, wearer first, everything else second, always. The transformation that followed lasted not 11 seconds. It lasted 4 minutes and 27 seconds. And when it was over, there was no White Room. There was a hole in the side of a building, morning air pouring through it, and a 16-year-old boy standing in a New Jersey field for the second time in 24 hours, breathing hard, alone, the Omnitrix cycling through defensive configurations and done waiting to see what the next room looked like. He ran. And somewhere above the clouds, at a distance that instruments in this universe had no category for, something ancient and patient and operating on a timeline that made decades look like seconds felt the energy signature for the first time, turned its attention downward, began to calculate distances. The Marvel Universe had spent 24 hours pointing everything it had at a boy who had arrived by accident, named him a threat before learning his name, and then, when he declined to be contained, had introduced an aerosol compound through his ventilation system in the pre-dawn hours. In the conference room, the debrief was already being drafted. In the file, the language would be careful. In 30 years, when the file was declassified, historians would read it and find the word incident used 14 times in 4 pages, and not once find the word mistake. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It chased the one it had just broken. You learn what a city sounds like when it is afraid of one person. That is the education nobody prepares you for, not the emergency broadcasts, not the carefully worded press releases using phrases like enhanced individual incident and precautionary civilian monitoring and no immediate threat to the general population. You learn it through your body, through the way the subway car goes quiet when someone pulls up the footage, through the way the coffee shop has every screen on CNN and the barista keeps watching the door between orders, through the way the school bus teacher tells her students to sit down with a voice that is steady and professional and hands that are visibly shaking. And the children obey because they can hear the difference between those two things even if they cannot name it yet. New York City had survived Loki. It had survived the Chitauri. It had survived events that rewrote the sky in real time. But those things had been outside, arriving through portals, falling from atmosphere, legible as invasion. This was different. This thing, this boy, this signal, this walking question mark with 11 helicopters overhead was already inside the narrative, already named, already decided upon by 19 million people who had watched 47 seconds and written their verdict before the battery died. Ben Tennyson ran for 6 hours before he stopped. Not from exhaustion. The Omnitrix's passive biological calibration operated his endurance on margins that made that word irrelevant. He stopped because running without direction is just falling with better footwork, and he had learned that lesson early and at significant personal cost. He stopped in a parking garage in Hell's Kitchen, 3rd level, northeast corner. The position that gave him 2 sight lines, 1 exit, and the specific quality of urban silence that means you are temporarily invisible to the things currently searching for you on a grid. He sat with his back against a concrete pillar and did what he had always done when the universe became too large and too loud and too certain about what he was. He thought about his grandfather. Max Tennyson across a campfire in a rust-colored RV, telling him that the hardest part of carrying power isn't the weight of it, it's the patience to let people catch up to what you already know you are. Ben pressed his palm flat against the concrete. Cold, real, specific. Above him, the helicopters maintained their patient circles, and he breathed, and he tried to be patient in a universe that had introduced a tranquilizer compound through his ventilation system 4 hours ago, and was currently drafting the document that would explain why that had been the reasonable choice. Daredevil found him at hour 7, not through technology. Matt Murdock had no surveillance infrastructure worth speaking of, which was, perversely, precisely why he found Ben first. He didn't track the energy signature. He didn't follow the government monitoring grid. He walked through Hell's Kitchen the way he always walked through it, listening to its heartbeat, its specific rhythm of threat and fear and ordinary human suffering layered over each other like sediment, feeling the place where that rhythm changed. 1 heartbeat in the northeast corner of a parking garage, elevated but controlled, the biological signature of someone who had been trained or had trained themselves to manage fear rather than be managed by it. He came in from the stairwell with no weapons visible, moving the way he always moved, like water finding its level, like the most spatially aware person in any room entering a room they have already fully mapped before stepping inside. He sat down against the opposite pillar without being invited. A long silence. Then, without preamble, without the careful, institutional language everyone else had been using since Tuesday morning, "You're not what they're saying you are." Ben looked at him. "How would you know?" Murdock tilted his head, that small, precise movement that meant he was reading the room through instruments no one else in it possessed. "Because your heart rate when you talk about hurting people sounds completely different from your heart rate when you talk about protecting them. And right now, thinking about whoever you left behind, it sounds like grief, not threat." A silence. "What's your name?" Ben told him. "Okay, Ben," Murdock said. "Here's what I know about this city. It will make you into whatever story it needs most. The question is whether you write it first." Meanwhile, the Marvel immune system escalated to full fever. And fever is the only accurate biological metaphor, because this was not strategy, not chess, not the careful deployment of measured force. It was the systemic overreaction of a body whose defenses had begun damaging healthy tissue because they could no longer distinguish it from the infection. SWORD elevated the Tennyson file to Priority Alpha, a classification level previously reserved for Thanos-tier incursion events. and began drafting a containment framework involving orbital asset deployment. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session, not because they possessed any operational capability here, but because a Security Council session is itself a signal, a message broadcast to every intelligence apparatus on Earth that the adults are present and the situation is managed. A message that convinces nobody but must be transmitted regardless, because the performance of control is sometimes the only control available. In Washington, 3 separate congressional committees began preparing oversight hearings. The hearings would not materialize for 4 months. The damage they had been assembled to prevent would occur in 4 days. That gap, between the speed of institutions and the speed of reality, is the geography where most of the century's worst decisions are born, and most of its worst decisions live, and most of its worst decisions are eventually justified in language so careful it barely resembles the thing it is describing. Wakanda moved differently from everyone else, and that difference was not cosmetic. Where Shield advanced with the blunt force confidence of an organization that had never been structurally required to question its own authority, and where Kamar Taj moved with the careful geometric precision of people who understood that rushing toward unknown power is itself a method of feeding it, Wakanda moved with curiosity. Shuri had been working for 36 consecutive hours on Omnitrix surface geometry analysis when she found it. Not a weapon schematic, not an energy weapon matrix, not anything that fit the framework the rest of the world was using to organize its fear. What she found was evidence of curation. The Omnitrix's alien catalog was not a collection, it was a selection. 10,000 species chosen according to a philosophical architecture she could only partially decode, but whose underlying principle was legible enough to make her sit very still for a long time before she called her brother. The principle was this: maximum diversity of survival strategy, minimum redundancy of method. Someone had built this device not to win fights. Someone had built it to preserve the idea that life, in every form it had managed to become across an entire galaxy, deserved a champion. She called T'Challa. She said, "We need to find him before Sahai Eld does. Not to contain him, to show him that at least one place in this world has read the instruction manual." The media entered its second phase at precisely the moment it always does. 36 hours after the initial event, when pure reporting exhausts its factual material and the opinion infrastructure takes over with the specific hunger of something that has been waiting, ready, pre-formatted for exactly this kind of story. The genuine ethicists asked real questions about consent, about the Registration Act's Legos, about whether a teenager from another universe possessed the same civil rights as a citizen. The opportunists asked louder questions with simpler answers and better thumbnails. The conspiracy networks built entire architectures of invented detail. The Omnitrix as Kree bioweapon, Ben Tennyson as an advanced scout for a coordinated second invasion, the Hoboken Field as a pre-selected landing site chosen for its proximity to 3 major population centers. None of it was true. All of it was spreading. And the truth? A scared kid in a Hell's Kitchen parking garage talking to a blind lawyer about grief at 3 a.m. was completely invisible, because the truth was always too quiet to compete on the frequency where fear broadcasts. The set piece happened on the Brooklyn Bridge at hour 41. Harker's cell had correctly anticipated that Daredevil would be Ben's first non-institutional alliance and had positioned accordingly, intercepting the movement toward a Dumbo safehouse contact with the precise, unglamorous efficiency of people who are very good at their work in the specific way that makes them more dangerous than anyone powerful. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Ben transformed twice. Forearms first. Four-armed, enormously strong, using the bridge's structural geometry to control the engagement space rather than escalate it, positioning combatants away from the remaining civilians with the practiced economy of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the objective was never destruction. XLR 8. Second, because the Omnitrix's threat assessment had correctly identified that the eastern pedestrian lane's cable tension was compromised, and that 300 miles per hour of localized kinetic precision across the suspension architecture would resolve the civilian evacuation faster than any alternative with less structural risk. That is a meaningful distinction. That is the distinction between a weapon and a mind using tools. When it was over, 12 operatives were incapacitated. The eastern lane needed structural assessment, and Ben Tennyson stood in the bridge's center, visible from every angle, breathing hard, 40 civilians behind him who were going home tonight because he had decided their lives were worth being misunderstood for. The headlines the next morning did not say hero. They said uncontrolled. They said escalating. They ran the XLR8 clip next to footage of the damaged pedestrian lane and let the juxtaposition do the editorial work. The image of 40 saved civilians present in the article, in paragraph 7, requiring the reader to already believe something generous before they reached it. And that is when Ben Tennyson understood, fully and permanently, the lesson that Peter Parker had been trying to warn him about since the parking garage. The lesson that every young hero in this universe eventually learns, the one that costs the most and teaches the most and never quite stops being true. They didn't realize they were teaching him one Marvel lesson perfectly. Heroes don't get to be children. Not one headline led with the 40 people who went home that night because a boy from another universe decided that saving strangers was worth the cost of being misread. Not one. And somewhere above the bridge, a camera drone circled and circled, and its footage fed 17 networks simultaneously, and the Marvel Universe kept doing what it had been doing since 6:47 a.m. on Tuesday, deciding what Ben Tennyson was, without once stopping to ask him. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It tried to own them. Doctor Strange had not slept in 51 hours. That was not unusual. The Sanctum ran on a schedule that had nothing to do with the sun, and his body had long since renegotiated its relationship with rest in ways that would concern a physician and did not concern him at all. What concerned him was the wall, not metaphorically, literally. The eastern interior wall of the diagnostic chamber, covered from floor to ceiling in 17 separate attempts to categorize the Omnitrix's arrival signature using every analytical framework he possessed. 17 attempts. 17 failures. Not the wrong answer. No answer. Each framework reached the edge of its own vocabulary and simply stopped, the way a river stops at a cliff, the water going nowhere, the map ending, the territory continuing without acknowledgement. Strange stood before that wall at 3 a.m. and understood, with the cold clarity that only arrives after decades of learning the precise shape of your own ignorance, that he was not looking at a gap in his knowledge. He was looking at a gap in the universe's knowledge of itself. The Omnitrix had not been built for this universe. It had been built for a different set of rules entirely, and it had carried those rules inside its architecture the way a traveler carries the smell of home in their coat long after crossing every border between there and here. The discovery arrived at 3:17 a.m. in the form of a dimensional resonance reading that Wong flagged from the monitoring array, a reading so faint that 3 automated passes had classified it as interference and moved on. Wong pulled it manually because he was, among his many qualities, constitutionally suspicious of background noise. His experience had taught him that the universe does not produce meaningless signals. It produces signals that haven't been asked the right question yet. The reading showed the hairline fracture, the 400-mile dimensional scar from Ben's arrival, logged on day 1, expected to self-heal in 6 weeks. Strange recalculated it, then recalculated it again by hand, the way his mentor had taught him when the instrument said something the mind refused. The number stayed identical both times. The fracture had widened by a factor of 3 in 51 hours, without any additional Omnitrix activation, without any new triggering event. It was growing on its own, fed not by Ben's transformations but by something far more difficult to address: resonance. The Omnitrix's continued existence in this universe was producing a low-frequency harmonic, imperceptible to standard instruments, not harmful in isolation, that was slowly, steadily widening the scar the way a sustained musical note widens a crack in glass. Patient, invisible, entirely inevitable unless something changed. Strange stared at the projection for a long time. Then he did the calculation he had been avoiding. If the expansion continued at its current rate for 19 more days, the fracture would cross a threshold he had encountered only in theoretical literature and one classified Avengers debrief he had spent 2 years trying to stop thinking about. It would become an incursion point, and incursion points sat in the same existential category as extinction, not metaphorically, not as hyperbole, but as a precise technical classification of the kind of event from which universes do not recover intact. He called the Avengers at 4 a.m. Not a request. Strange did not request, he informed, with the gravity of a man who had looked at worse things than this and understood that the tone of a briefing is a luxury available only when the evidence needs help. It didn't. The data was presented cleanly, completely, without editorial framing. 22 minutes. The room was very quiet by the end, and then the fracture inside the Avengers, the one that had been forming since the first conference room argument over 3 words, reached its own threshold. Because Strange's data did not produce one conclusion, it produced 2, irreconcilable, symmetrically terrible. Conclusion 1. Ben needed to return to his universe as quickly as possible through a controlled dimensional bridge using the fracture's own geometry as a navigational anchor. Dangerous, technically unprecedented, survivable in the most optimistic modeling. Conclusion 2. If controlled return was impossible, or if the timeline exceeded 19 days, the fracture would require sealing by other means. Strange did not elaborate on other means. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room who understood dimensional mechanics understood it instantly. Everyone who didn't understand dimensional mechanics understood it from the faces of those who did. The room held that understanding in silence for 4 seconds. Then everyone began speaking simultaneously, and the silence was gone, and what replaced it was worse. Sam Wilson spoke first, before the silence could calcify into something that gained the weight of consensus simply by being allowed to settle. We are not discussing option 2. We are not writing it in a document, not putting it on a whiteboard, not letting it become the thing we circle back to when the other options get hard. That is a child. He arrived here by accident. He has saved civilians twice in 48 hours without being asked, without institutional authorization, without anything except his own judgment about what the right thing to do was. We do not get to treat that as a variable to be managed by elimination. The room did not agree or disagree. The room did what rooms full of people who know someone is right but cannot afford to be limited by rightness do. It went carefully, professionally neutral. And in that neutrality, Sam Wilson saw the thing he had feared since the first briefing. Not malice, not Vit, Laney. Not the cartoonish evil of Hydra's planning documents. He saw calculation. The quiet, institutional, genuinely well-intentioned calculation of people who believed they were protecting something larger than one boy's life. People who were wrong in the specific way that history's worst decisions are always wrong, not from cruelty, but from the mathematics of necessity dressed in the vocabulary of wisdom. That combination, Sam had learned, was the most dangerous thing a conference room could produce. More dangerous than malice. Malice, at least, knows what it is. 40 blocks south, at the same moment the conference room was deciding what Ben Tennyson's life was worth in dimensional mechanics terms, Peter Parker was sitting on a rooftop with Ben Tennyson. Ben was looking at the Manhattan skyline with the expression of someone filing it away, not enjoying it, not mourning it yet, but recording it with the specific attention of someone who understands at a cellular level that they may not see it again and wants to make sure they looked properly while they had the chance. Peter had told him about Strange's briefing. Not all of it. Not option 2, not the 19-day clock, but enough. Enough that Ben understood the shape of what was forming in the rooms he wasn't allowed inside. He sat with it for a long time. The city hummed. Finally, he said, "In my universe, there was a man named Vilgax. He wanted the Omnitrix for 10 years. He tried everything. Armies, assassins, reality manipulation. You know what almost worked?" Peter waited. The moment I thought the people I was fighting for had decided I was more trouble than I was worth. He looked at the watch. Green-white. Steady. I didn't let it work then. He looked at Peter. I'm not letting it work now. Peter stared at him for a moment. then said, quietly and with the particular certainty of someone arriving at a decision they have been building toward for days, "Then let's make sure they don't." To get to that moment. The cosmic attention arrived without announcement, as it always does, because things that large have no need of it. The entity that turned its focus toward Earth at 4:31 a.m. was not Thanos. Thanos was a philosopher with a methodology, and what turned its head that morning was something older, something that predated methodology the way the ocean predates boats. Uatu the Watcher appeared at the edge of the moon's shadow, as was his custom, and looked at the fracture in Earth's dimensional membrane, and looked at the boy on the Manhattan rooftop, and looked at the Omnitrix with the specific quality of attention that occurs when a being of sufficient age and magnitude encounters a piece of craftsmanship so extraordinary that it produces, even in something that has witnessed the formation of galaxies, a moment of pure recognition. He did not intervene. That was not what changed. What changed was subtler and more consequential. The fact of his looking was itself a signal. In the cosmic information architecture, a watcher paying attention is a broadcast. It says, "This is a hinge moment. Something here will not be the same afterward." And the things that listen for that broadcast, the things that position themselves at the fulcrum of reality's turning points to extract maximum leverage from the pivot, heard it simultaneously across 3 timelines from a war room that existed outside the calendar entirely. Kang the Conqueror read the convergence with the calm of someone for whom this kind of moment was a professional category rather than a surprise. The Omnitrix's arrival was not, in isolation, interesting to him. Dimensional displacements occurred constantly across the multiverse, most of them irrelevant, statistical noise in the vast machinery of infinite branching timelines. What was interesting was the fracture. More specifically, the fracture's address. The dimensional coordinates pointed back to a universe he had visited once, briefly, and marked in his catalog with a notation he now retrieved and read with fresh attention. It said, "Azimuth's work. Do not interfere. Risk calculation unfavorable." He read it twice. The notation had been written by a version of himself who had assessed the situation with full information and concluded that the risk outweighed every possible gain. He read it a 3rd time, then he crossed it out. Because a 19-day window before an incursion-level event, combined with a 16-year-old boy who was simultaneously the most volatile and most valuable asset in the current timeline, that was not a warning. That was an invitation. And Ben Tennyson, on his rooftop, watching the city breathe below him and feeling something shift in the dark spaces between stars in a way he could not name but recognize the shape of, had no way of knowing that the most dangerous thing in his immediate future was not Strange's Option 2, not Hydra's extraction teams, not SWORD's orbital countermeasures. It was a man in a room outside time who had just decided that a warning written by himself was not sufficient reason to stop. The sky had turned its head, and what lived behind it was already smiling. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It failed to notice that the real threat had never been the miracle at all. Kang the Conqueror did not arrive with armies. That was the first thing that surprised everyone who had been briefed on him, who had studied the incursion records, war-gamed the scenarios, sat through the classified threat assessment sessions that always ended with the same uncomfortable conclusion: no clean solution exists. He arrived alone. On day 9 of the 19-day window, in the FE form of a transmission that appeared simultaneously on every encrypted Avengers frequency, every SHIELD monitoring channel, and, most disturbingly, on the personal phone of Ben Tennyson, whose number existed in no database in this universe, whose device operated on a frequency the Omnitrix itself generated, and which should have been, by every technical definition available to every intelligence architecture in the Marvel ecosystem, completely and permanently unreachable. The transmission was 12 seconds, no visual. Voice modulated to that particular register of absolute calm that only belongs to people who have already calculated every possible response to their message before sending it. It said, "Ben Tennyson, you have 10 days before the fracture becomes permanent. The people protecting you know this and have not told you. I can close it cleanly, return you home intact, and ask only one thing in return. Do not let them rush you into a decision before we speak. The ones who call themselves heroes have already written the document. Ask them what it says. Peter Parker heard about the transmission 4 minutes after it happened from Sam Wilson, who had the expression of a man who had been proven right about something terrible and found no comfort in the proof whatsoever. The document Kang had referenced was real. It had been drafted on day 6 by a 3-person subcommittee operating under a classification level that excluded both Peter and Sam from its distribution. A bureaucratic architecture that was not, in the technical sense, a conspiracy, because conspiracies require the participants to believe they are doing something wrong. These participants believed entirely the opposite. The document was 7 pages. Its official title was Contingency Framework, Asset Green Dimensional Resolution Protocol. Its operational summary, stripped of the 17 layers of institutional language that had been carefully applied to make it readable without being felt, said the following. If controlled return proved impossible within the 19-day window, and if the fracture continued its expansion toward incursion threshold, the Omnitrix would be separated from its wearer by any means necessary and used as a navigational anchor to seal the fracture from the inside. The phrase separated from its wearer was doing an enormous amount of moral work in that sentence. Peter read it once, then read it again, then put it down with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something already broken. He said nothing for a long time because there was nothing that language in any of its registers was adequate to say. Ben had spent 9 days inside the Avengers' operational facility being, by every observable metric, exactly what Sam Wilson had called him in that first conference room argument. A child trying to be good inside a system that kept reclassifying his goodness as a threat variable requiring management. He had mapped Omnitrix capabilities against Marvel threat taxonomies with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the best argument for trust is demonstrated competence. He had identified 3 Omnitrix forms capable of interfacing with Stark-era energy infrastructure in ways that addressed known grid vulnerabilities, contributions that the operational team had quietly filed and used and not publicly attributed, because attribution created documentation, and documentation created questions, and questions required answers that the institutional framework was not yet prepared to give. He had done all of this with the knowledge that the rooms he wasn't allowed inside were running a different conversation. He had dues. Need it anyway, because the alternative, withholding his capability until the institution proved itself worthy of it, was not a version of himself he recognized. When Peter came to him with the document, Ben read it with the stillness of someone who had suspected this and had been hoping, with a specific and disciplined optimism, to be wrong. He closed it, looked at Peter, said, "How long?" Peter told him. Ben nodded once. The nod that meant, "I see. I understand. I am filing this in the part of myself I will address when there is margin for it." Then, what does Kang actually want? That question split the room when Peter brought it to the full team, because it was also the question that revealed, with surgical precision, exactly how far the internal fracture had progressed. The tactical answer was straightforward. Kang wanted the Omnitrix's dimensional coordinates, the navigational data embedded in its arrival signature, which would give him a verified pathway to Azimuth's universe. A universe he had previously assessed as too dangerous to enter without a confirmed route, and had marked accordingly in his own catalog. In exchange, he was offering a genuine solution, a controlled fracture closure using temporal mechanics that Strange confirmed, with the expression of a man tasting something he deeply wished tasted differently, were technically sound. The problem was not technical soundness. The problem was that providing Kang a navigational map to Azimuth's universe, to Ben's universe, to everyone and everything that had produced the Omnitrix, was an act whose consequences extended so far beyond the 19-day window that no one in that room could model them with any confidence. They were being asked to trade a certain present harm for an uncertain future catastrophe, and the certain present harm wore a face, and the uncertain future catastrophe wore the face of everything else. That is an impossible calculation. The rooms where impossible calculations are performed always end up producing the same outcome. They produce whatever the person with the most institutional authority was already inclined toward, dressed in the language of collective deliberation. Sam Wilson said no, immediately, completely, with the force of someone for whom this was not a calculation but a boundary. The SHLD liaison said the tactical assessment required fuller analysis, which was the specific language used by people who had already decided but needed the deliberation to have occurred on record before the decision was formalized. Strange said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man running 17 simultaneous probability threads and not yet trusting any of them enough to speak. The legacy Captain America said something that revealed the fracture's texture more clearly than anything preceding it. What if we give Kang partial coordinates? Enough to close the fracture, not enough to navigate. The room considered it. Ben, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table since being admitted for the first time to a meeting about his own situation, said, "Kang will know if the data is partial. He reached my phone. He is operating on a timeline that already includes this deliberation. Anything we offer that is less than what he asked for, he has accounted for." A silence. I know, because it is exactly what I would do if I were him, and I was certain the people across the table were going to try to be clever. He looked around the room. I've been doing this since I was 10. I know what a trap looks like from the inside. Nobody answered. The room processed it in the specific way rooms process being outthought by the person they have been treating as the pro. Malam. Peter made his choice at 2 a.m., alone in a corridor, after 3 hours of sitting with the weight of it in the specific way you sit with decisions that offer no version of innocence, regardless of which direction you move. He had been Spider-Man since he was 15. He had made hard calls before, calls that cost him things he hadn't known he was willing to lose until they were gone. But this was different, because this was not a call made under pressure, under fire, with no time for reflection. This was a call made in a quiet corridor with complete information and adequate time and the full knowledge of what each available path produced at its end. He accessed the document through a channel that his Stark-era credentials technically permitted and that the spirit of the classification framework technically prohibited, a gap he had been aware of since day 6 and had been not using deliberately because using it meant becoming something the institutional framework would define as a traitor, and he had been trying, with the specific and exhausting optimism of someone who still believed in systems, to find a version of this that didn't require that. There was no such version. He copied the document. He walked to Ben's room. He slid all 7 pages, unredacted, including the subsection titled Wearer Separation, Methodology and Authorization Chain, under the door. He stood in the corridor afterward for a moment, then went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed and understood with complete clarity that he had just become the traitor in someone's official record. He also understood, with equal clarity, that there was no version of himself that could have done otherwise. Some choices don't offer innocence. They only offer honesty about what you value, when honesty costs everything you built. Kang's second transmission arrived the following morning, and it was different from the first. Less offer, more accounting. He had observed the previous 18 hours of deliberation. He had noted the document's recent unauthorized distribution. He was adjusting his timeline accordingly. He now required an answer within 48 hours rather than the offered 10 days. The fracture, he noted, had accelerated overnight. Fed not by omnitrix activity, but by emotional resonance cascading from extreme psychological stress in a bonded omnitrix wearer. A phenomenon Asmuth had documented extensively, a phenomenon that no one in this universe had known to monitor. Ben's fear, his grief, his anger at the document, his complicated feelings about Peter's choice, all of it had fed the fracture the way a storm feeds a flood. The universe expressing its response to suffering in the language of physics rather than sympathy. Strange confirmed the acceleration data without speaking. The 48-hour clock appeared on the briefing room's display in red numerals. Every face in the room turned toward Ben Tennyson with the expression of people running out of runway. Ben looked back at them, his grandfather's patience, his own hard-won certainty. And then he said the sentence that nobody in that room had prepared for. The one that changed the shape of everything that followed, that made the 48 hours run differently than any institutional framework had modeled. "I know how to close it," he said. "I've known since day 3. I was waiting to see if you'd ask." The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It finally, too late at enormous cost with the clock already running, began to listen. You want to know what it sounds like when a room full of the most capable people on Earth realizes they have spent 9 days solving the wrong problem. It does not sound like anger. It does not sound like embarrassment, though both are present underneath the surface like structural damage that hasn't yet expressed itself as visible collapse. It sounds like the ventilation system, like a chair shifting, like Director Hill pressing 2 fingers against her temple with the deliberate precision of a woman who has built her entire career on seeing the complete board, sitting with the moment that career has a crack in it. Ben Tennyson sat at the end of that table and let the silence do its work, because he had learned that from his grandfather too, that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who have been underestimating you is simply wait and let the air pressure of reality do the arguing for you. He had been waiting 9 days. The room had finally run out of alternative explanations for why he might be wrong. He was not wrong. He had not been wrong since day 3. The difference between day 3 and now was 48 hours on a red clock and a fracture that had been widening while everyone deliberated about whether to ask him the question whose answer he had already prepared. The plan was elegant in the way all genuinely good solutions are elegant. Not through complexity, not through the deployment of resources that required weeks to assemble, but through the use of what was already present and already true. The fracture, Ben explained, was not a wound in the conventional sense. It was a seam, the dimensional equivalent of split fabric, and like all seams, it had a directionality, a grain, a preferred axis of closure. The Omnitrix's arrival had created it by passing through the dimensional membrane at an angle the membrane's natural elasticity could not compensate for in real time. But the membrane wanted to close. That was its default condition. The reason it hadn't was the same reason Strange's diagnostics had been producing incomplete results. The fracture was being held fractionally open by the Omnitrix's ambient signal, not intentionally, not maliciously, but the way a key holds a lock open simply by existing in the lock it was designed for. Remove the signal. The membrane closes. The removal did not require destroying the Omnitrix, which was the assumption every institutional framework had been working from, and which was the assumption that had made Option 2 feel, to the people drafting it, like a logical endpoint rather than a catastrophic failure of imagination. It required something different, something more specific, something Azimuth had built into the architecture as an absolute final contingency and documented in a technical language that no instrument in this universe had been calibrated to read. For approximately 9 minutes, the Omnitrix needed to go completely dark, every function suspended, every emission silenced, the watch becoming inert in the specific way that only occurred under one biological condition that Azimuth had designed as unforgeable. Ben would need to let it believe completely that its wearer was dead. Strange leaned forward and asked the question that the rest of the room was still processing the full implication of. What happens to you during those 9 minutes? Ben looked at him with the steady, patient honesty of someone who had already sat with this answer long enough to make peace with it. Not acceptance of an acceptable outcome, but the specific peace that comes from deciding a cost is worth paying before you are asked to pay it, so that when the moment arrives you are not deciding, only acting. The Omnitrix's biological support systems go offline. The passive cellular enhancements, the threat response buffers, the physiological monitoring architecture. For minutes. I'm just a person. A normal, unaugmented, 16-year-old person standing in a room with a closing dimensional fracture that will produce, at its peak compression point, an energy release roughly equivalent to a localized gamma-level event. He paused. There's a form I can use to shield the immediate area. Chromastone. It absorbs and redirects energy at the molecular level. The biology of a species that evolved on a world of pure radiation and learned, over millions of years, to make endurance from what would destroy anything less specifically adapted. I go in as Chromastone, I trigger the shutdown. The fracture closes around the Omnitrix's silence, and for 9 minutes I stand in the center of whatever the fracture releases, and I take it. Another pause, shorter. If Chromastone's absorption capacity is sufficient, I reactivate the Omnitrix when the fracture seals and I'm fine. He did not complete the conditional. He did not need to. Everyone in the room completed it independently, in their own language, arriving at the same destination from different directions. Sam Wilson closed his eyes for a moment. Peter Parker went very still. Strange reached for his instruments and did not speak. The 48 hours that followed were the most densely inhabited hours of Ben's time in the Marvel Universe. Not because of what happened operationally, though enough happened operationally to fill a classified report that would remain sealed for 30 years, but because of what happened in the small human spaces between preparation. Strange ran 17 successive models of Chromastone's absorption threshold against fracture release projections. He produced a survival probability. He declined to share it with Ben, a decision he would describe later in a private conversation with Wong that he never repeated publicly as both wrong and completely understandable. In the way that a great many terrible decisions are both wrong and completely understandable, which is precisely what makes them terrible. Shuri transmitted a technical package from Wakanda overnight. 3 vibranium weave support structures that, when positioned correctly around the fracture site, would dampen the energy release by an estimated 23%, shifting the survival probability from the number Strange hadn't shared to a slightly less terrible number he also didn't share. Matt Murdock drove up from Hell's Kitchen at 3 a.m. for no tactical reason whatsoever and sat in the facility's common room for 4 hours without offering anything, without advising anything, simply present. And this, of all the things that happened in those 48 hours, was what Ben Tennyson later said meant the most. He didn't try to fix it, he just sat there, like he was saying, "You're real, you're a person. I see you. Not the watch, not the asset. You." Kang made his final move at hour 36. Not a threat, not a demand. An offer, constructed with such precise understanding of the room's psychology that refusing it required actively choosing a worse outcome for someone other than yourself, which is the specific architecture of the most sophisticated traps, the ones that work not by constraining choice, but by making the generous choice and the strategically dangerous choice identical. He contacted Ben directly, bypassing every monitoring system with the casual ease of someone for whom security infrastructure is a historical curiosity, and he offered something that no institutional framework could have produced and no Avenger had the authorization to give: verified dimensional coordinates for Ben's home universe, a guaranteed return window, and confirmation, verifiable, real, not leverage but information, that his grandfather, his cousin, everyone he had left behind when the displacement happened was unharmed and searching for him. The price remained unchanged. Azimuth's universe's navigational data. And he gave Ben 6 hours to decide alone, without the Avengers' voices in his ear translating his choice into their framework. "You have earned," Kang said, in those 12 seconds, in that impossible calm, "the right to make this decision yourself. They have been making decisions about you since the moment you arrived. This one is yours." Ben sat with it for 4 hours, then walked to the briefing room and told Strange to begin preparing the fracture site. The betrayal happened at hour 41, not from Hydra, not from the Magia, not from any of the external forces that the briefing room threat assessments had been modeling since day one, because the threat assessments, like all institutional documents, were better at modeling external threats than internal ones, because internal ones require the modelers to include themselves in the threat taxonomy, and that is a thing institutions are structurally designed to avoid. It came from a Shai-El, the operative, whose name the official record would eventually protect through the specific anonymization applied to people whose actions the institutional record needed to distance itself from, while also declining to fully condemn. He had 3 children. He had been at the Battle of New York. He had watched the Chitauri kill 47 people in his block in 20 minutes, and had spent 8 years since then building a version of himself around a single organizing principle. The calculus of maximum lives saved was the only honest ethical framework available to someone who had seen what he had seen. He accessed the Kang channel. He transmitted the navigational data, not the full package, but enough to give Kang the road. He did it believing completely that Ben's plan was a child's optimism dressed as a solution. He did it believing he was preventing something worse. He did it, and he was wrong, and he understood he was wrong approximately 4 seconds after transmission confirmed, when Kang's response arrived not with gratitude but with the precise, professional tone of someone noting the occurrence of an event they had already placed on their timeline. The operative sat alone in the monitoring room and understood, in the way that cannot be unfelt once it arrives, that he had just handed a conqueror the address of a universe that had no idea he was coming. He had done it to save everyone, good intentions. The universe remained entirely indifferent to them. Ben felt it when it happened, not the transmission. He had no access to monitoring systems. He felt it in the Omnitrix, which had been engineered to detect dimensional pressure changes with the sensitivity of an instrument built by the greatest scientific mind in its universe. He felt the navigational data leave like warmth pulled from a room when a window opens. Sudden, directional, irreversible. He was in the preparation area, surrounded by Shuri's vibranium structures and Strange's geometric ward lines, and Peter Parker standing 6 feet away doing his best impression of a person who was not terrified. Ben said nothing for a long moment. Then, someone just gave Kang what he wanted. Strange went completely still. Which means the deal is done from his side. Which means we do this now, before the 48 hours expire. Before Kang decides whether what he received is sufficient or whether he wants more. He looked at Peter. Peter looked back. The room was absolutely quiet. "I need you to tell me something true," Ben said. "Not protocol, not assessment. Something true." Peter did not hesitate. "You're the best person I've met in this universe," he said, "and I'm sorry it cost this much to meet you." Ben nodded, turned to the fracture site, raised his wrist. The Omnitrix recognized the sequence. The transformation began, and in the corner of the room, on a screen nobody was watching anymore, the red numerals of the 48-hour clock continued their patient countdown. No longer the most important deadline in the room, because the most important deadline was now, and it was wearing Chromastone's body, and it was walking toward a fracture in the fabric of reality with the quiet, specific courage of someone who has already decided that the cost of the right thing is not a reason to stop doing it. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It watched one walk into the fire and held its breath. You will never fully understand what it costs a person to walk towards something that might kill them when they have already run the numbers and chosen to walk anyway. Not because the mathematics of courage are complicated, they are brutally simple. They reduce to a single variable every time. But because the understanding requires you to locate, inside yourself, the specific place where fear lives, and then imagine choosing, with complete awareness of that place, to keep moving despite it. Most people never find that place because they never have to. Most people live their entire lives at a comfortable distance from the version of themselves that would exist if everything was on the line simultaneously. Ben Tennyson had found that place at 10 years old, in a summer that was supposed to be ordinary, when a watch attached itself to his wrist, and the universe handed him a bill he hadn't ordered. He had been paying it in installments ever since. He crossed the threshold of the fracture site at 4:47 a.m., and the air changed immediately. Not temperature, not pressure, but quality. The molecular texture of a space where the rules of physics were operating at reduced confidence, where the wall between what is and what could be had round thin enough to feel on your skin like static electricity, like the held breath of something enormous trying to decide whether to exhale. Strange had walked Ben through the transit mechanics with the thoroughness of a teacher who understood this was the last lesson and wanted it complete. The navigational memory would guide the bridge's formation. Ben simply needed to activate the sequence and enter at the moment of peak aperture, which would last approximately 4 seconds and required forward momentum at entry rather than a standing step. The physics of a ghost imprint address demanded kinetic commitment, the way you need a running start to clear a gap that standing stillness cannot reach. Energy expenditure would be significant, but within the Omnitrix's current capacity. The probability of successful transit was... Strange paused here, in the way people pause when the number they are about to say is not the number they want. 71%. Ben said, "And the other 29? Strange said, "A range of outcomes, the least favorable being mistransit to an unintended dimensional address." Ben was quiet for a moment. "Grandpa used to say 71% is a good day in the plumbers." He looked up. "What did your mentor say about odds like that?" Strange considered it. "He said the universe rewards people who move." Ben nodded once. "Okay then." And that was the entirety of his response to a 29% probability of being lost somewhere in the infinite corridor of the multiverse. Okay then. The specific acceptance of someone who has decided the alternative Standing still, waiting for certainty that this universe had demonstrated it would never provide, was the only outcome he was genuinely unwilling to accept. Chromastone was 7 feet tall and built like a cathedral compressed into humanoid geometry. All facets and angles and internal light, every surface a precise instrument of the biology that had learned across millions of years on a world that would vaporize Standard O, organic matter in seconds to make endurance its art form. Strange had studied the form's energy absorption parameters for 11 hours and had arrived at the conclusion that the theoretical maximum was sufficient. Barely, in the most optimistic of his 17 models. He had not shared which model was most optimistic. He had not shared what the other 16 said. Ben had not asked. Strange had noted this in his private record later with the admission that it had impressed him more than almost anything else he had witnessed in 3 decades of working alongside individuals of extraordinary capability. He had already run his own calculations, Strange wrote. He simply chose not to spend his remaining preparation time being afraid of the numbers. I have met sorcerers of 30 years' practice who could not do that. The vibranium structures Shuri had sent from Wakanda were positioned at the 3 prescribed angles, humming at a frequency below hearing but above the threshold of physical sensation, felt in the back teeth, in the base of the skull, in the place behind the sternum where fear and awe share a border. Strange held the ward lines, their geometric perfection visible even to non-mystic eyes as a faint luminescent architecture surrounding the fracture site, 23 points of anchored dimensional pressure holding the event inside a boundary it could be contained within. Peter stood at the threshold, outside the operational perimeter, exactly where protocol required and exactly where he did not want to be. He did not look away. The fracture was visible now, and that was new, because for 9 days it had existed only as numbers on instruments, a concept requiring technical translation to become real in the human nervous system. Now, at the 90% expansion threshold, it occupied space in the actual room. A vertical scar approximately 12 feet tall, all and 4 feet wide, its edges not sharp but softly indefinite, and through it, nothing recognizable. Not another place, not another dimension's landscape, just a quality of light that was wrong in a way that produced, in every human nervous system present, a deep and wordless biological instruction to look away. Nobody looked away. The vibranium structure's hum accelerated fractionally as the fracture's proximity increased its resonance load, the sound shifting upward through the range below hearing into the range of physical discomfort. The kind of frequency that makes old injuries ache and produces the specific taste of copper at the back of the throat. Strange pressed one hand flat to the ward line anchor point nearest him and recalibrated without breaking the geometric integrity of the array. His expression carried the total focus blankness of someone for whom extreme difficulty has become a professional register. Not calm, but the functional equivalent of calm that exists when there is no margin available for anything except the task. The Omnitrix shutdown sequence required something that no external instrument could replicate and no adversarial actor could forge. It required Ben Tennyson to consciously, voluntarily, completely release the survival instinct that the Omnitrix spent every second of every day amplifying. Not courage, not determination, not the controlled management of fear. It required him to stop wanting to live, in the specific technical sense of clearing the biological signal that the watch read as, host is threatened, maintain protection, maintain function, maintain life. It required, in other words, a moment of perfect peace, not resignation, not acceptance of death as a likely outcome. Peace, the kind that arrives when you have done what you came to do, said what needed saying, been what the moment required. Ben Tennyson stood in the center of a fracture in reality, inside a universe that had named him a threat before it had learned his name. He, surrounded by people who had tried to own him, and people who had tried to protect him, and at least one person who had driven from Hell's Kitchen at 3 a.m. to simply sit beside him in the dark and witness him as a person rather than a protocol. He thought about his grandfather, the campfire, the rust-colored RV, the version of himself that existed before the watch found him, and the version that existed because it had. He found the peace. It took 11 seconds. The Omnitrix went dark. The silence lasted one breath. Then the fracture began to close, and silence became entirely the wrong word. The sound was not an explosion. It was an implosion. A vast inrush of dimensional pressure through a narrowing aperture, the universe reclaiming its structural integrity all at once with the force of something that had been held open against its nature for 11 days and was done being held. Chromastone's body lit from within, not the steady crystalline glow of its normal biological function, but something total and consuming, every facet of that alien biology simultaneously processing an energy input that Azimuth's data had classified as survivable, and that the fracture's actual release was now demonstrating was a more complex conversation than classification had captured. The vibranium structures screamed, a harmonic shriek at 17 simultaneous frequencies that the recording equipment would later describe as the single most complex sound event it had ever been calibrated to process, and then held, Shuri's engineering making good on the 23% reduction promise with 3 seconds of structural margin to spare. Strange's ward lines bent inward visibly, the geometric architecture straining against a load it had been designed for at its absolute engineering maximum. The sorcerer himself pressed to one knee with both hands flat on the floor and his expression wrying the specific blankness of someone maintaining something the universe is actively trying to unwrite. The 9 minutes did not feel like 9 minutes to anyone in the room. Not as metaphor, but as a literal consequence of the dimensional pressure event's effect on local time perception, a phenomenon Strange would spend 3 weeks documenting afterward with the obsessive methodological thoroughness of a man processing trauma through the only framework that had ever reliably held his attention. It felt longer. It felt like the kind of duration that exists in the worst dreams, where time is measured in the weight of what you are afraid of rather than the movement of a clock. Uatu watched from the moon's shadow and did not intervene, because that was his function and his burden, and the oath he had broken before and would not break again for anything smaller than the end of everything. And this was not the end of everything. This was one boy holding a fracture closed with a borrowed body. And that was perhaps the most significant act of individual will he had witnessed in 3 decades of watching this particular corner of existence. But it was not the end of everything, and the distinction, while real, brought him no discernible comfort. At the 7-minute mark, Chromastone's body began to fracture, literally, hairline cracks appearing across the crystalline surface, the violet-white light leaking through them in thin, bright lines, the absorption capacity reaching its ceiling in the specific way that ceilings reveal themselves. Not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly and completely and all at once. Strange saw it happen and made a decision in the space between 1 second and the next. A decision that bypassed committee, bypassed protocol, bypassed every institutional voice that had been filling conference rooms for 11 days. He took 3 of his ward lines and redirected their energy into Chromastone's fracture points, burning through the geometric precision. He had been maintaining at significant personal cost, gambling that the fracture's remaining 2 minutes of closure required less mystic containment than Chromastone's body required structural reinforcement. He was right. By a margin he would later describe, privately, as uncomfortably close to being wrong. The cracks held. The light stabilized. The 9th minute passed. The fracture sealed with a sound like a held breath finally and completely released. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not the operatic conclusion the scale of the event seemed to demand. Just the profound and quiet completion of something the universe had been trying to finish for 11 days. The room went still. The vibranium structures powered down. The ward lines dissolved. Strange stayed on one knee for a moment before standing. In the center of the fracture site, where a crystalline body had been standing, Ben Tennyson lay on the floor in his own shape, 16 years old, completely ordinary, the Omnitrix dark on his wrist and his chest moving with the shallow, rapid breathing of someone whose body has survived something it was not built for and is running a rapid inventory of the damage. Peter reached him in 4 seconds and put one hand on his shoulder and said his name, and Ben opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and said, with the specific exhausted humor of someone who has been through enough to find his own near-death experiences mildly comedic, "So, did it work?" Strange, still lowering himself from one knee to standing, looked at his instruments. The fracture reading was 0. The dimensional membrane sealed, clean, complete. No residual resonance, no remaining scar, no structural compromise in the surrounding membrane. He looked up from the instruments. His voice, for the first time in 11 days, contained something that was not calculation. "It worked," he said. "And the wortimos." It carried briefly the texture of a man who has been reminded that sometimes the impossible simply chooses to be possible, and the correct response to that is not analysis. It is gratitude. Raw, uncomplicated, institutional, language-free gratitude for the fact that a 16-year-old boy from another universe decided, 9 minutes ago, to be still enough to save a world that had spent 11 days deciding what to do with him. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It immediately convened a meeting about what to do with the one that had just saved them. The fracture was gone. The crisis was resolved. The boy who had solved the problem that 17 institutional frameworks had failed to solve was lying on a medical cot in the facility's recovery room, and the institutions were already in the conference room deciding what to do with him. That is not cynicism. That is not editorial. That is the documented sequence of events, time-stamped, verifiable, available in the classified record that will be sealed for 30 years, until the people in that room are either dead or retired, and their decisions can be assessed without threatening the careers of the people who made them. The fracture sealed at 5:14 a.m. The conference room convened at 5:47 a.m. 33 minutes. Ben Tennyson had been unconscious for 22 of them, his body running on reserves the Omnitrix's passive systems were only beginning to replenish, and in those 22 minutes the people responsible for his safety had already begun the process of converting his survival into a policy question. This is what institutions do. It is precisely what they were built to do. The tragedy is not that they do it. The tragedy is that they do it without noticing. Director Hill opened the meeting with a phrase that would appear verbatim in 3 separate congressional hearing transcripts over the following 4 months. Now that the immediate threat has been resolved, we need to establish a sustainable framework for the ongoing situation. The ongoing situation ends, but the boy, not Ben, not the person who spent 9 minutes absorbing a gamma-level dimensional event so that the rest of us would not have to. The ongoing situation, the specific bureaucratic language that takes a human being and converts them, through careful word selection, into a category requiring management. Sam Wilson, who had been awake for 31 hours and had the specific pallor of a man operating on conviction where sleep should be, said, "His name is Ben. I'd like us to use it." Hill looked at him. The look contained 17 layers of institutional history, 3 layers of genuine personal respect, and 1 layer of exhaustion that matched his own exactly. "Ben," she said, and returned to the briefing. It was a small concession. It was also the largest one available in that room at that moment, and Sam Wilson accepted it because he had learned over years of this work that the smallest concessions are the ones you fight hardest to hold, because they are the ones most easily given back when the room decides it needs the space. The factions had not dissolved overnight. They had rearranged themselves around the new reality, which was that the fracture was closed, the existential threat resolved, and the only remaining question was the one that had been underneath every other question since 6:47 a.m. on day 1. What happens to Ben Tennyson now? The PSY-ELD position was supervised integration, a formalized arrangement in which Ben remained in this universe under a monitoring framework, his capabilities cataloged and deployable under agreed conditions, his movements tracked, his Omnitrix activity logged. The language was careful. The intentions behind it were not entirely cynical. The operational reality of it would have been, as anyone who had spent 5 minutes thinking clearly about it could see, indistinguishable from the asset acquisition framework that Hydra and the Magia had been pursuing since Hour 4. Dressed in the language of protection, given a government letterhead, made legitimate by the signatures of people who genuinely believed they were doing something different from what they were doing. The Wakandan position, transmitted via secure channel from T'Challa, was sanctuary, unconditional, no monitoring framework, no deployment conditions, the offer of a place where Ben Tennyson could exist as a person rather than a protocol. It was the most generous offer on the table. It was also, in the political reality of this universe, the most complicated to execute without triggering a cascade of international incidents that would consume the next year of diplomatic bandwidth. Everyone in the room knew this. The Wakandan delegation knew that everyone knew. The meeting proceeded with this shared unspoken knowledge sitting at the center of the table like the most important guest who had not been formally introduced. The operative who had transmitted the navigational data to Kang was in the room. That detail made the morning surreal in a way that no operational debrief had protocols for. The person who had handed a time-traveling conqueror a roadmap to Azimuth's universe sitting at a table discussing Ben Tennyson's future, as if those two facts existed in separate moral categories that the meeting's agenda could keep from touching each other. Peter had known since hour 41. Sam had been told at hour 43. Neither had gone to hill with it yet. Not from cowardice, not from strategic calculation, but from the specific paralysis that occurs when you are facing a decision that causes significant harm, regardless of which path you move along, and you are hoping, against the available evidence of the previous 11 days, that a third path will present itself if you wait long enough. The third path had not presented itself. The navigational data was gone. Kang had it. What he was currently doing with it existed in the unknown, which was itself a category of information that Strange had been quietly working on for 3 hours and had not yet shared because his threshold for certainty before speaking was high enough that not yet certain meant something genuinely worrying was forming in his calculations. And something genuinely worrying forming in Strange's calculations was a specific category of bad news that the room did not yet have the capacity to receive. Ben woke at 6:23 a.m. to find Peter Parker in the chair beside his cot and Matt Murdock standing near the door, which was, he later said, exactly the configuration of presences he would have chosen if anyone had thought to ask. His body felt like it had been disassembled and reassembled by someone working from a verbal description rather than direct experience. Functional, complete, but with a residual strangeness in every joint and nerve pathway that the Omnitrix's repair architecture would spend the next 48 hours quietly correcting. The watch itself was active again, its green-white light steady and slow pulsing, reassuring in the specific way that the presence of something carried since childhood is always reassuring regardless of what it costs. The familiarity of it, a form of continuity when continuity is the thing you most need and least have. He looked at Peter. Peter told him everything, completely, without omission, without the careful partial disclosure that institutions use when they believe they are protecting someone by managing what that person knows about their own situation. He told him about the factions. The language, the operative, the transmission, the navigational data. The fact that Strange was working on what Kang had done with it and had not yet produced an answer that he was willing to say out loud. Ben listened to all of it with his eyes on the ceiling and his hands still at his sides, organizing a very large amount of information into an order that would allow him to act on it clearly. Then he sat up. "I need to be in that room," he said. Peter looked at him. I know what I just," Ben said, with the quiet finality of someone who is done being discussed in rooms he is not inside. "They need to hear me decide." He walked into the conference room at 6:41 a.m., and the room recalibrated the way rooms always do when the subject of their deliberation enters unannounced. He looked smaller than the event. That was always the dissonance with Ben Tennyson in person, the gap between the scale of what he carried and the scale of the body carrying it. 16 years old, dark circles, borrowed clothes that did not quite fit, the Omnitrix on his wrist catching the overhead light. He stood at the end of the table and looked at the room, and the room looked back and nobody spoke for a moment. The morning came through the windows gray and specific, the city audible 40 floors below, the helicopters finally gone, pulled back to their bases in the aftermath of the fracture's closure, their surveillance contract with this particular crisis concluded by the 0 reading on the monitoring array. He said, "I've heard your frameworks. I want you to hear my decision." Hill said, "Ben," he said, "please." One word. Simple, complete, without aggression or performance. It landed in the room with the weight of everything he had spent 11 days not being asked for, and Hill stopped. And the room stayed quiet, and he spoke. His decision was not what anyone expected. Not exile, not supervised integration, not sanctuary, not any option the instit. Utional imagination had been cycling through since day one. His decision was this: he was going home, not through Kang's deal. That door was closed, the data gone. That offer existed in a timeline that had been superseded. He was going home through a method the Omnitrix's navigational memory had been quietly calculating since the moment the fracture sealed, because the fracture, in closing, had left a ghost imprint in the dimensional membrane, a faint residual address, the cosmic equivalent of the impression left in a pillow after the sleeper has risen. Enough for a reckless transit. The Omnitrix had been running the probability since Ben regained consciousness, since before he had spoken to Peter, since before anyone in this room had been told the option existed. He had not mentioned it immediately because he had wanted to understand the shape of what he was leaving behind before he left it. He had wanted to know, with certainty, what this universe had been and what it had tried to be, and what the gap between those two things looked like from the inside. "I know what I am to this place," he said. "I know what the document says. I know about the transmission." He looked at the operative. The operative went very still. "I'm not angry. I understand the calculation. I've seen people make it before, and I've seen what it costs them after." He looked around the room. "But I'm not an asset. I'm not a framework. I'm a person, and I'm going home. And what you do with what I leave behind, the precedent, the questions, the fact that you wrote that document at all, that's yours to carry, not mine." The room was silent. Then Sam Wilson stood, crossed to the end of the table, and extended his hand. Ben looked at it for a moment, then shook it. And that was the moment. Not the fracture closure, not the 9 minutes, not any of the operational spectacle that would fill the CLA's ossified record. That was the moment Peter Parker later said he understood what Ben Tennyson actually was. Not a hero in the Marvel sense, not a weapon, not a symbol requiring management, something rarer and harder to categorize. A person who had been handed every possible justification for becoming what the world accused him of being, and who had looked at each justification in turn and simply, stubbornly, at ongoing personal cost, declined. Strange entered the room at 6:58 a.m. with his calculations finally complete, and the room received the information it had been dreading. Kang had used the navigational data not yet to travel but to archive the address, marking Azimuth's universe in his catalog with a verified pathway that existed outside time in the same way all of Kang's records existed outside time, permanently, across every timeline he inhabited simultaneously. The road was built. It could not be unbuilt. Wherever Ben went when he walked out of this room, he was going home to a universe that a conqueror now had directions to. Ben heard it. Looked at the Omnitrix, looked at the window, took a long breath. Then I'd better get home before him. And that's when Marvel did what it always does to miracles. It let one walk out the door, and stood very quietly in the space where it had been, surrounded by the aftermath of everything it had almost become. You want there to be a send-off. That is the human instinct, the one that survives every disillusionment, every education in the way things actually work. Every lesson the world has given you about the gap between what people deserve and what they receive. The instinct that says a person who did what Ben Tennyson did deserves a moment proportional to the cost of the doing. A crowd, a ceremony, something that tells the story correctly from the outside, that makes the shape of what happened visible to the people who only saw the 47-second video and the Alien Kid headline and the Brooklyn Bridge footage and the off. EICL press release describing the fracture event as a dimensional anomaly successfully contained by a joint Shai-Eld and Avengers operation. You want the record set straight. You want the version that uses his name, that describes the 9 minutes accurately, that says clearly and without institutional insulation what a 16-year-old boy from another universe absorbed so that this one would not have to. You want that version to exist somewhere people can find it. It doesn't. That is the first thing you need to understand about the ending. The correct version of events is in a classified file with a 30-year seal, and the version that exists in the world is the one the institutions needed, and those two versions are so far apart they might as well be describing different events in different universes, which, in a sense, they are. The departure corridor had been chosen by Strange for its structural reinforcement and its complete absence of surveillance coverage. Two requirements that existed in direct tension with each other and that sub-level 3 satisfied simultaneously, which was why it smelled of industrial coolant and old concrete and had fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency that set every nervous system in it slightly on edge. Strange walked Ben through the transit mechanics one final time, with the thoroughness of a teacher who understood this was the last lesson and wanted it complete. The navigational memory would guide the bridge's formation. The aperture would hold for approximately 4 seconds. Forward momentum at entry was not optional. The physics of a ghost imprint address demanded kinetic commitment, the way you need a running start to clear a gap that standing stillness cannot reach. Energy expenditure significant, but within the Omnitrix's replenished capacity. Transit probability, 71%. Ben said, Grandpa used to say 71% is a good day in the plumbers. Strange said, My mentor said the universe rewards people who move. Ben nodded. Okay then. 4 words. The entirety of his response to a 29% probability of being lost somewhere in the infinite branching corridor of the multiverse. Okay then. The acceptance of someone who has decided that waiting for certainty, in a universe that had demonstrated for 11 days that it would never provide it, was the only outcome he was genuinely unwilling to accept. The people present in that corridor were not there because protocol required them. Protocol required almost none of them. The operational necessity was strange. The dimensional mechanics were strange. The ward line infrastructure was strange. Everyone else was there because they had chosen to be, which is a different category of presence entirely, the kind that carries a specific weight that institutional presence does not. Shuri had taken a supersonic transport from Wakanda and arrived 40 minutes before the window. She spent those 40 minutes in the corridor's far corner reviewing Omnitrix navigational data on a holographic display, not because it was applicable to anything she would ever build, but because she had been in the same room as the most extraordinary piece of engineering she had ever encountered, and she was constitutionally incapable of being in that room without fully witnessing it. Sam Wilson stood with his arms crossed and his expression carrying the specific combination of pride and grief that belongs to people who have watched someone younger than them demonstrate a kind of courage that makes their own look like a draft. Matt Murdock stood near the door and said nothing, which was exactly right. Wong made tea from somewhere and offered it to no one and set it on a conduit housing, and it went cold and nobody touched it, and somehow that felt like the most human thing in the room. Peter Parker stood beside Ben in the 40 seconds before the sequence activated and did not say most of what he wanted to say, because most of it was for himself rather than Ben, and he had enough self-awareness to know the difference and enough respect for Ben to act on it. What he said was, If you ever get back here, accidentally, intentionally, any way at all, find me first. Before Shai yelled, before anyone else. Find me. Ben said, You'll be the first call. A pause. You're a good person, Peter. Peter looked at him. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The corridor smelled of coolant. You're better, Peter said. I hope your universe knows that. Ben smiled. The first full, unguarded smile Peter had seen from him since the parking garage in Hell's Kitchen, since Matt Murdock had sat across from him in the dark and simply witnessed him as a person rather than a situation requiring management. It was the smile of someone who was, against considerable odds and at significant personal cost, going home. Then the sequence activated. The corridor filled with green-white light, dimensional geometry folding through the air in patterns that Shuri was recording and Strange was reading and everyone else was simply experiencing with their entire bodies. The pressure, the warmth, the ozone smell, the vibration in the back teeth, the sense of the world briefly reconsidering its own edges. The aperture opened. Ben ran. He hit the threshold at full speed, exactly as instructed. For one fraction of a second he was visible in the light. A silhouette, entirely human, entirely ordinary, the Omnitrix a bright point on his wrist. Then he was gone. The aperture closed. The corridor was silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the coolant smell remained, and the Marvel Universe for the first time in 11 days contained one fewer miracle. The aftermath was documented, processed, institutionalized, and filed with the efficiency the Marvel Universe applies to everything it cannot fully understand and is not willing to simply sit with. The operational debrief took 3 days. The congressional oversight hearing, when it happened 4 months later, lasted 2 weeks and produced a report that used the phrase "enhanced individual of extra-dimensional origin" 47 times, and the name Ben Tennyson twice, both times in footnotes. The operative who transmitted the navigational data to Kang received a formal censure, a 6-month administrative reassignment, and no criminal prosecution, on the grounds that his actions had occurred within the ambiguous operational space created by an authorization framework that multiple senior officials had signed without fully reading. The kind of accountability that satisfies the procedural requirement of accountability while doing nothing to address the condition that produced it. Strange published a technical paper on Omnitrix-class dimensional transit signatures that was immediately classified above the threshold of any journal capable of publishing it, read by 11 people, and influenced precisely 0 policy decisions. The 40 civilians from the Brooklyn Bridge organized their own acknowledgement. No press, no institutional sponsorship, a handwritten sign in green marker that said, "Thank you, Ben," propped against the eastern railing. It was removed by city maintenance workers the following morning. Someone photographed it before it was taken. The photograph still exists somewhere in the internet's long memory. Small, undiscovered, and completely true. Peter Parker left the Avengers' formal operational structure 6 weeks after the departure. Not dramatically, no confrontation, no cinematic rupture. He filed the paperwork, returned the equipment, had a brief conversation with Sam Wilson that both of them described afterward as necessary and terrible and clarifying, and returned to being Spider-Man on his own terms, in his own city, at the scale where he had always been most honest with himself. He kept the personal log. The last entry he made about Ben Tennyson was written 14 months after the departure, at 3 a.m., during a sleepless night that had no specific cause he could name. It said, "I still think about what he said in the parking garage, about the person who tried to protect him and then got offered something they wanted more. I think about it when I'm in rooms where decisions are being made about people who aren't in the room. I think about it when the language gets careful. I think about it when I'm about to agree to something technically correct and essentially wrong. I don't know if that's his legacy, I don't know if he'd want it to be, but it's what he left in me. And I'm trying, honestly trying, to make it worth something." The fracture site was studied for weeks after closure. What the researchers found, the ones with sufficient clearance, the ones who knew what instruments to use, was not what they had expected. They had expected residue, the dimensional equivalent of a healed scar, tissue that had been through something and showed the marks of having been through it. What they found was different. The membrane at the fracture site was not scarred. It was, according to the most sensitive instruments available, stronger than the surrounding tissue. Not damaged and repaired, genuinely, structurally stronger, as though the process of being held closed from the inside by a crystalline body absorbing everything the fracture could release, had reinforced the membrane rather than merely sealed it. Shuri received the data in Wakanda, sat with it for a long time, and wrote an analysis that was classified immediately upon submission. Her analysis said, "The structural improvement is localized but significant. Its mechanism is not fully understood. The most accurate description of what occurred is that someone stood in a wound and refused to let it be a wound. And the wound became, in the place where it was held, stronger than what surrounded it." She paused at that point in her writing, then added one final sentence, not technical, not analysis, included because she believed it was true, and because the record, however sealed, deserved one true thing, stated plainly. "We did not deserve him. I hope his universe does." Kang visited Azimuth's universe on a Tuesday. We do not know which Tuesday. His relationship with the calendar is not a relationship the calendar participates in. We do not know what he found there, or what he did, or whether the thing he went looking for was something Azimuth had anticipated and fortified against, or something that arrived faster than any preparation could address. What we know is that the navigational data extracted from 11 days of crisis in the Marvel Universe was precise and verified and permanent, and that the road it described did not expire, and that somewhere in the infinite branching corridors of the multiverse there is a version of events in which a boy spent 9 minutes absorbing a gamma-level dimensional event to protect a universe that, in the very act of being protected, handed the most dangerous man in time the address of his home. Ben Tennyson made it back. We are almost certain of that. The transit probability was 71%, and the universe rewards people who move, and there is no version of this story worth telling in which Azimuth's greatest work and Max Tennyson's faith and 3 years of a child carrying an impossible weight end in a mistransit to an unintended address. He made it back. He walked through the door of the rust-colored RV and sat down across from his grandfather and did not say everything, because he never did, because some things are too large for the first telling, but he said enough, and Max looked at him the way Max always looked at him, with the complete and unconditional recognition of a person who has always known exactly who he is looking at, and said, "Rough trip?" And Ben said, "You could say that." And the fire burned, and the stars were the right stars, and the universe outside the window was the one that knew his name. In the Marvel Universe, the sky was different. Not visibly. No instrument would flag it in any routine diagnostic. No civilian looking up would see the change. But the people who knew how to look could see it. The membrane was stronger where the fracture had been. The night was a little darker everywhere else. And in the classified record, in the file with the 30-year seal, in the section describing the event's lasting consequences in the evacuated language of institutional analysis, there was one line that every person who read it remembered afterward. The line that all the bureaucratic insulation in the world could not quite flatten into meaninglessness. It said, "The subject's presence produced no permanent infrastructure damage, no lasting civilian casualties, and no unresolvable systemic threat. The permanent consequences of the 11-day event are 1 sealed dimensional fracture, 1 verified navigational breach to an unmonitored extra-dimensional address, and an unquantifiable but observable shift in the ethical framework of at least 3 operational personnel, the long-term institutional implications of which are not yet fully understood." In a universe of gods, the most dangerous thing was never Ben's power. It was the fact that he still believed power should be used to save people, and that belief, small and stubborn and impossible to kill, was what he left behind, not in the files, not in the records that would be declassified in 30 years for historians to argue over, in the people who had been in the room, in the ones paying attention, in the ones who would spend the rest of their careers in conference rooms where decisions were made about people who weren't present, and who would hear, in the careful language, in the comfortable frameworks, in the word neutralization sitting in a document with its cursor blinking, the echo of a 16-year-old boy standing at the end of a table, saying, "Please," and who would choose sometimes at personal cost to do better. That was his legacy. Not a memorial, not a corrected headline, not a statue or a recognition or a fair accounting in any record the world could find. Just the people who had watched him, and been changed by it, and carried the change forward into a universe that remained, stubbornly, expensively, imperfectly, and absolutely worth it, worth saving. And that is where we leave it. Not with a victory parade, not with a corrected headline, with a campfire, and the right stars, and a boy who went home, and a universe that got quieter and darker and stronger in the one place where he had stood. Drop your verdict in the comments. Was the Marvel Universe worth saving? Did Ben make the right call? And the question that keeps me up at night, who do you think Kang found when he finally arrived at Azimuth's door? Because that story, that's the one that comes next. You already know what to do.